We're in chapter 4 of Genesis. This is Cain and Abel. Very famous individuals. One more famous than the other. But we are on Cain and Abel. You remember they've been kicked out of the garden. They are now being raised. They are fixing to have two boys. Some people say that they are twins because of the word again that is found in verse 2 of chapter 4. The third word again, which means immediately after. So if you want to say they're twins, great. If you don't want to say they're twins, great. We just know that these are two people. These are two actual people. This is not fairy tale. You are now going to see from chapter 4 on, from here on out, all the way through the death of Christ on the cross. The entire Bible is about God rebuilding the relationship with man. In the Old Testament, he rebuilds or doesn't rebuild the relationship, but you have the Day of Atonement. He builds a complete relationship with man when Jesus Christ died on the cross. So from here on out, it is a rebuilding stage. It only took 3 chapters to destroy it, or 1 chapter really to destroy it, and then it's going to take the rest of the Bible for a rebuilding stage. He doesn't come complete with man in the Old Testament because you remember the holies of holies in the holy place. Only one person is allowed to enter into that. You're not allowed to come into contact with God like we can now. In the Old Testament, it is a one person taking their sins, taking the sins of the people to God. That is the high priest, which is Aaron. And then in the New Testament, we have a ultimate high priest, or a main high priest, which is Jesus Christ, and that brings us to the point we're at in 2017, which we can go to Christ. In chapter 4, you will see that you're going to be introduced to 2 individuals. This is what Bible theologians call an antediluvian period. Ante means before, and diluvian means flood. So this is before flood. Certain people's names are going to be mentioned in this period. There's only 3 women's names that are going to be mentioned actually during this time. It is found actually in the same chapter. It's going to be Eve, of course, and then it is going to be Ada, and then Zillah, which is found in verse 23. So very important individuals in chapter 4. You have to use a lot of common sense and common knowledge when you're dealing with chapter 4. A lot of things are not written down per se in this chapter. You have to go to Leviticus. You have to go to Numbers during the Levitical period to kind of put pieces together. Although God does not say everything that He says in the Bible, He does give us common sense when we're studying the Bible to kind of put 2 and 2 together. So, when we are looking at chapter 4, you have 2 individuals. You have a man by the name of Abel, and his name means vapor or breath, which describes our life here on earth as a vapor. You have the man by the name of Cain, which his name means possession or to grab hold of. So you have Cain and Abel. We don't know if they're twins, but we're just going to go with that. Abel, you need to write down, he is found in Luke 11, Luke chapter 11. We'll look at that here in why don't we just read that and just kind of leave that with you, and then we'll come back to it. In Luke chapter 11, let's see if I can find it. Luke 11, 49 through 51. Gives us, and this is speaking from the lips of Christ. Okay, so whatever he says is going to be absolutely true. Luke chapter 11, verse 49, it says, "Therefore also said the wisdom of God, I will send them prophets," very important word, "and apostles." Okay, prophets and apostles. Apostle means sent one, and prophet means to speak of God. So he is going to send them prophets and apostles. "And some of them they shall slay and persecute." Okay? Now, verse 50, "that the blood of all the prophets," and a prophet is somebody that proclaims a message given to them by God. Okay? "The blood of all the prophets which was shed from the foundation of the earth may be required of this generation. That goes back a long way, right? Foundation of the earth. From the blood of Abel, that is a prophet, from the blood of Abel unto Zacharias. So that tells us that Abel was much more than just an individual that was a sheep herder. Abel was a what? Prophet. Tells us in Luke. From the foundations of the earth. Who was the people that we know that came after the foundations of the earth? We have 4 people. Adam, Eve, Cain, Abel. Then you're going to have Seth that's going to come later on, and he is of the line of Christ. But Abel is a prophet, according to Jesus Christ, and you can pretty well take to the bank what he says. And what is a prophet? A prophet is somebody that proclaims a message. You have major prophets and you have minor prophets in the Old Testament. You have people like Jeremiah, Elijah, Elisha, and then you have the minor prophets like Nahum, and you have Jonah, people like that. But what a prophet does is they speak what God tells them to speak. When you study the prophets, it will usually say, and the word of the Lord came unto so-and-so. Go tell my people that I said this. One of the major prophets that we know of course, is Moses. God never speaks to the children of Israel. He always speaks through his prophet or through Moses. So a prophet is somebody that proclaims a message given to them by God, according to the Old Testament, according to the New Testament. So we know now that Abel is a prophet. Please keep that in mind. What we have heard about Cain and Abel is basically what somebody has told us. We rarely go into an in-depth study about Cain and Abel. But you are going to see the results of man's fallen state. They've been kicked out of the Garden of Eden, and now you're going to see the results of what sin brings. Okay? Now, and it says, and Adam knew his wife. We don't know how long time has passed between chapter 3 and 4, but Adam knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bare Cain, which means to got, or I have gotten something, or I have a possession. It says, because I have gotten a man from the Lord. Even back during the time of Genesis, they see how important a man is, or a boy child is to the family. Carries on the family name. So you see immediately what the importance of having a boy is. And the first child that comes is a man by the name of Cain, and she is rejoicing. And it's amazing that if you were, what's the old saying, a picture's worth 1,000 words. If you were to paint a picture and say, this is what happiness looks like, you would draw somebody's face and it's smiling with roses and sunshine and all that kind of stuff. You would say, well, we're going to draw a photo of what somebody who looks sad looks like. And it's going to be frown, droopy eyes, rain clouds. But if you was to draw a photo of somebody that is a God hater or a reprobate, somebody who is a sinner, somebody who's lost, you would draw a picture of a man by the name of Cain. Nothing ever is said positive about this individual. Nothing is ever said positive about him. You can find it in the book of Jude, verse 11. You can find it in 1 John chapter 3. Talks about going the way of Cain. There is a way that seemeth right unto man. You have 2 ways according to the book of Matthew. You have a broad way, a narrow way. You have a big gate, small gate. And you have these 2 individuals who are going to choose different paths. You're going to have Cain and you're going to have Abel. But when you study Cain, nothing is ever good said about him. It is always how he is evil, how he is a reprobate, how he is a sinner. So, Eve gets a boy, gets a man from God. And again, there is that word, and she again, which a lot of people will say, well, that tells us that this is an immediate, another birth right after Cain coming out. So that's why they believe that they are twins. And it says, and again she bare his brother, which is immediately. It doesn't tell us anything about the way they're raised. We can assume that they are raised the same. We can assume that they all had, Abel was raised the exact same way Cain was raised. We don't have any indication that there was any favorites showed. You remember when Jacob kind of played favorites with Joseph, gave him a coat of many colors, and then you get to the realization that's why the brothers hated his guts so much. But when you get with Cain and Abel, there's nothing that says that they loved Cain better than Abel. As a matter of fact, when Cain was born, you hear Eve say, I got a man from God. But when Abel is born, what does she say? Nothing. So there may be Cain was maybe a little bit more favored than Abel, but we don't know any differences of their raising. They was both raised the same, raised in the same house. More than likely, and we went over this a couple of weeks ago, my days are bad off. How many times Adam and Eve told Cain and Abel about the Garden of Eden? How many times did Adam and Eve tell them about the tree of knowledge? How many times did they tell them about how they was kicked out? How many times did Eve talk about that serpent? Who better equipped to raise children and to show them the path of righteousness and what you should do than Adam and Eve? People that actually walked and communed with God. The first people that are actually kicked out of a perfect world. So these are the kind of parents you're dealing with. It says it again in verse 2. She bare his brother Abel. Now, Abel's a shepherd and Cain's a farmer. Anything wrong with those professions? Does it say anything was wrong with being a farmer? 90% of the people, if you live back during Jesus' time, you was one of three occupations. You were a farmer, you were a shepherd, or you were a fisherman. Those are three occupations you got to choose from. That was about it. Everyone had to know how to farm. There was no such thing as a food world. Everyone had to know how to raise sheep, know how to make to spin the wool. So you have two occupations. It doesn't say that one was better than the other. It just says that one was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. Now, over a period of time, it says, in a process of time, it came to pass that Cain brought. Now, how do we know? How does Cain know to do this? Are we told in the Bible that God sits him down and says, all right, at a certain day and a certain time of the day or a certain time of the year, you have to make a sacrifice? We are not told that. But where is the sacrifice before this? Do you remember what God had to do to cover their sins?
He had to kill them and make the clothes.
All right, so we can assume that God laid down an ordinance for these boys, right? How else would they know to bring something to God? How are you going to do something unless you're told? So we can assume that God has ordained them that you bring a sacrifice. Because you have to remember, these guys are not living in the same dispensation that we're living in. Before the first sacrifice that Kenneth was talking about, they were living in a perfect world. There was no need for a sacrifice. There was no need for a death of an animal or a blood sacrifice because there was no sin in the world. But after that sin is committed, what is the only way that God covered that sin? Like Kenneth said, there had to be a killing. All right? Now, in the book of Leviticus, you have several different types of offerings or several different types of sacrifices. All of them include a death of an animal except for one. That is the grain offering. All right? The grain offering is when you would wave 2 loaves before God. Basically, that was symbolic of saying, thank you, God, for what you've given to us as far as food, as far as being able to eat, and letting everybody know that everything comes from God. Okay? We'll get into the offerings later on if we ever have time. But when you study Leviticus and places like that, you do have grain offerings, you do have sin offerings, trespass offerings, things like that. So, in a process of time, and it came to pass that Cain brought the fruit of the ground an offering of the Lord. Okay? Is there anything, did we see anything odd about that? He's a tiller of the ground, right? He's a farmer. So he's going to bring the fruit of the ground. Okay? Now, in Abel, he also brought the firstlings. That is very interesting. Let's go back to verse 3. Cain brought of the fruit of the ground. There is a word missing there. One brought the fruit of the ground, another brought the firstlings. You know what the firstlings means when you're dealing with something like that? The very best. And if you was living back during the Old Testament, you had a bunch of sheep. What you would do is most of the time, if you were living in, let's say we're all the children of Israel wandering in the wilderness, all right? And we all had sheep. When it came to that day of atonement, the high priest would go out and he would search out sheep and find the most perfect sheep that he could find. We would all hope it would come from our flock. He would not pick a sheep out that had any type of blemish whatsoever. And what Abel did is he brought the very best that he could offer God. How does he know to do this? Are we told that God comes down and says, I want the very best? We have to assume that God has told them, these boys, that, right? Who else is there to direct them? They don't have a high priest. Book of Leviticus has not been written. We can assume that God has told them, listen, you have to bring a blood sacrifice. Did God sacrifice a grain of wheat to cover their sins? He sacrificed what, Kenneth? An animal. All right? So it says in the process of time that Cain just brought fruit from the ground, offering up to the Lord. Now, what was cursed? God cursed something very important. What did he curse? The ground. What did Cain bring forth from?
The ground.
Which was cursed. Now remember, if you go to the grain offering, okay, that was symbolic of God, you're responsible for all the goodness. Okay? Just because they brought something from the ground in the grain offering, it was not cursed. It was symbolic of saying, God, you supplied this. All right? Keep that in mind. So he's going to bring an offering from the Lord, from the ground, which is cursed. And Abel brought also the firstlings of his flock, of the fat thereof, the very best he had to offer. Okay? Now, it says, and the Lord had respect unto Abel and to his offering, but unto Cain, the offering, he had not respect. So one day, in the process of time, here goes Cain. He gets all of his fruits, pomegranates, figs, whatever he grows, out of a cursed ground, brings it to God. There's two ways that people approach God. You remember that when Jesus was dealing with the woman at the well, you worship God in spirit and in truth. There's two ways you approach God. And one of these ways is wrong. You can approach God in the way of, look what I have done, and look how great I am, and look what I can give you, God. Or you can approach God as a broken sinner, knowing that you deserve death in hell and you need a Savior. You see how these two boys approach God. One of them just brings whatever he can out of the ground, but Abel is the type of individual that he is going to search, and he is going to search, and he's going to find the very best that he has to offer God, and he's going to offer it to him. When you get to the book of Leviticus, they will go, Moses receives that step-by-step instruction on the Levitical sacrifices. But right now, you have Cain and you have Abel, and it says, this is interesting, but Cain unto his offering he had not respect. And Cain was not just mad. He was beyond mad. He was wroth and his countenance failed. All right? He gets mad not at himself, but he gets mad at two individuals. He gets mad at God, and he's going to get mad at who? Abel. If you notice, there's two people missing in this whole conversation. Where are they at? They're not there. Okay? You never hear Adam come up and say, Cain, you better straighten up. You better quit acting like you're acting. These are grown individuals. Adam and Eve's not there. You know what's amazing about somebody that's a reprobate? They always have bright beginnings. You ever notice that? There's never been a child born on this earth that a mama holds and says, you ain't going to be worth killing one of these days. Every baby that a mama holds, she's got great beginnings for this kid. He's going to be president, surgeon general, going to be a lawyer, going to be a doctor. He's going to be the greatest person to ever walk. But if you're a reprobate and you thumb your nose at God, your end, there's no greatness to it. And maybe we've got time to look at that. So Cain is very wroth and his countenance failed. My wife, I can tell, and she can tell with me, the moment I walk through the door, the moment she walks through the door, what kind of day she's had. You know why? On her face. Same with you guys. I can tell when my wife says it's a blessing, I think it's a curse. I can tell pretty much what kind of day y'all had on Sundays or what kind of week y'all had. Real easy. All I got to do is look at your face. And more than likely, most people you ever heard that expression, they wear their feelings on their face? You know, the thing that got Cain, the thing that separated Cain and Abel was not only their offering, but he was very wroth and his countenance failed. And, all right, now this is very important. And the Lord said unto Cain, Why art thou wroth, and why is our countenance fallen? Okay? Does God know why he's mad? Know why he's mad. Did he know where Adam and Eve was at in the garden? Yeah. He says, why are you mad, and why is your countenance fallen? Now you're going to see what grace is. You see a picture of grace when God makes them clothes in chapter 3, verse 21, right? You're going to see another picture of grace. He's going to give Cain an opportunity to make it right. And God does that with us. Do you know it? Do you know what God could have done immediately when he found out that offering was not right? God could have killed him. When you study the offerings in the book of Leviticus, if that sheep or that lamb or that turtle dove, there's anything wrong with it, if there's any sin that the high priest has, if he goes in there with any kind of pride, prejudice, anything, immediately God kills him. You remember the Ark of the Covenant? What happens when God tells them, don't touch it? Immediately, whoever touched that ark, they died, didn't they? But you see a picture of God's grace here in verse 7. He says, if. I'm going to give you a chance, Cain. How many times a day does God do this to us? Thousands. And you don't have to shake your head yes or no. Have you ever been mad at God? We get mad at God. You know why? We're human. You know why? Because we are born and bred out of Adam and Eve. All right? It says, if thou doest well. I'm going to give you a chance, Cain. That offering you brought wasn't right. But I'll give you one chance. He says, if thou doest well, shalt thou not be accepted. If thou doest not well, sin lieth at your door. And unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over him. Okay, I'm going to give you a choice. You can go back. I'm going to give you a mulligan. You can go back, and you can do it right. You can bring the right sacrifice, the right offering, with the right heart, and the right attitude, and the right mindset. If you do that, sin's going to be gone. But if you do not do that, something's going to rule over you, sin. He is giving Cain a chance. You would think that after all the stories that Eve has told them boys, if God tells you to do something, you do it. If God says do not do it, you better not do it. They've heard that story 1,000 times. And I guarantee Cain could quote that. He could probably quote Genesis chapter 1 and 2 by heart. And they've heard over and over, if you don't do it, God's going to get you. If God tells you to do something, you better do it. Because that word if you'll just do it. This is what I wanted to point out to you about Abel being a prophet. If you ever get a chance to, if you have a couple of 100 years, you can study the prophets and all they do. The prophets never spoke unless God tells them to speak something. God says, you go tell them that I said. Of course, you have false prophets. You have Balaam, people like that. But true prophets, God will say, listen, you go tell them that I said. If they do this, then this is what will happen. If they don't do this, this is what will happen. According to the book of Luke, Abel is a prophet, right? So what does a prophet communicate? What God speaks. And Cain does what? Talk. How many people do we know on earth at this time? 4 people. And if human nature is the same today as it was 2,000 years ago, when you get mad at somebody, you're going to go tell somebody about it, aren't you? Who is Cain mad at right now? He's mad at God. Now, if you look up the word talk in Hebrew, it gives you several different definitions. But the word talk right here in verse 8 of chapter 4 has got 4 definitions. I'm going to read them to you. It is to command, it is to counsel, it is to preach, and it is to pass sentence. Okay? You've got 2 people talking. You've got Cain and Abel. Something is said between those 2 boys that Cain doesn't like. What has just happened to Cain? He has just got reprimanded by God, right? What does a prophet do? He speaks to what God tells you to say. What is basically Abel telling Cain to do? You better listen to what God's telling you to do and get your hind end back there and make a right sacrifice. You know what's amazing about the true gospel, it makes people mad. It does. When you preach exactly what the scriptures say, it will make people either mad, happy, glad, or sad. It does it every time. And Cain is talking with his brother Abel. And it came to pass when they were in the field, something happened. Abel says something that Cain he doesn't like. So if we're looking at that Hebrew word, what it means in chapter 4, verse 8, apparently Abel is either commanding, he is preaching, he is giving counsel, or he is passing sentence. Cain doesn't like it. So what is Cain going to do? He's going to kill the messenger. Happens today, doesn't it? Cain rose up against Abel, his brother, and that word slew means absolutely to slaughter. First murder. What is the result? Why is that murder there? Because of what happens in the previous chapter. When Eve listens to the serpent. You see the results of sin. That's already starting to tear his family apart. And the Lord said unto Cain, you ever notice Abel doesn't talk? You never hear him say anything. What does Cain always do? He's belly aching and griping in him. And the Lord said unto Cain, where is Abel thy brother? And he said, I know not, am I my brother's keeper? I don't know. You know what God's given him a chance to do a second time? Confess. That is a picture of God's amazing grace. Cain, if you'll do right and go back and give the right sacrifice, you'll be fine. I forgive you sin. If you don't do this, guess what's going to rule over your life? Sin. Cain does not do that, and guess what's ruling over his life? Sin. So after he kills his brother Abel, God says, where's he at? I don't know. It ain't my fault. Mom and Dad didn't hold me enough. Didn't give me the right car that I wanted when I was a kid. It's all their fault. It's not my fault. He says, where's our brother? He says, am I my brother's keeper? And he said, what hast thou done? The voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground. The ground that you brought your the ground of the fruit that you brought that is cursed is the ground now that is crying up with your brother's blood. Art thou, now look, verse 11, and now art thou cursed from the ground, which has opened her mouth to receive thy brother's blood from thy hand. When thou tillest the ground, it shall not henceforth yield unto thee her strength. A fugitive and a vagabond shalt thou be in the earth. Is it not amazing how God gives him a chance in verse 7, and then he gives him another chance in verse 9 to confess and to come clean. And Cain doesn't do it. You never hear a confession out of Cain. You never hear him say, I'm sorry. God, forgive me. I know what I did was wrong. Just give me a second chance. Give me a third chance. This is what reprobates and sinners always do. And I'm 45 and I've been in church all my life. And I see it all the time. When thou tillest the ground, it shall not henceforth yield her strength. A fugitive and a vagabond thou shalt be on the earth. And Cain said unto the Lord, it ain't fair. Odd, isn't it? People still do that today. God, I know that what I've done is not my fault. It's society. It's the way I was raised. It's not fair. My punishment is greater than I can bear. What should God have done? Should have killed him, shouldn't he? You know what God's showing to him for a third time? Mercy and grace. There's two types of grace in the Bible. You know that? There's a salvational grace, and then there's just a common grace. Common grace doesn't save you. You know what common grace is? You know what got you to this church tonight? It's just common grace that God gives. Because it rains on the just like the unjust. Those people that are lost, and they're reprobates, and they're God haters, they still have a measure of grace from God. You know that? Because they're allowed to get up in the morning. They're allowed to see His beauty. They may have great help. But that grace doesn't save. There's a salvational grace. You know what God is giving right now? He's giving Cain. He's going to give him just common grace. Because he should have killed him. And he says, and Cain said unto the Lord, my punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, thou hast driven me out this day from the face of the earth, and from thy face shall I be hid. And I shall be fugitive, and I shall be a vagabond of the earth. He never quits. From that day forward, Cain never gets to settle down. He is constantly moving, constantly moving, constantly moving. And it says, and it shall come to pass that everyone that findeth me shall slay me. Who's these other people he's talking about?
That's what I've always wondered.
They had more kids, you know that, right? Okay? Back then, you married your sister. You had Adam and Eve, and that's it. Then you had Cain, and you had Abel, and had kids, and kids, and kids, and kids, and kids, and kids. He says that from now on, everywhere I go, my relatives are going to kill me. They are going to look upon me and kill me. Because they know what kind of God they serve. They know that God has gave him grace and mercy, and when they was kicked out of the Garden of Eden, they should have been killed. But Adam and Eve has told people, man, God's gracious. God's good, boy, he's good to us. And then Cain thumbs his nose at God. He says that everywhere I go, people that find me are going to slay me. They're going to kill me. It's not fair, God. We hear that all the time, don't we? And the Lord said unto him, therefore, whosoever slayeth Cain, vengeance shall be taken upon him sevenfold. And the Lord set a mark upon Cain, lest any finding should kill him. Go to Jude, verse 11. It's right before Revelations. Well, and then I want to ask you a very important question. There's two ways, right? There's only one chapter in Jude. Verse 11 it says, and woe unto them, for they have gone the way of Cain and run greedily. Nothing positive is ever said about that guy. Do you know it? Nothing. He's given grace. He's given a chance to repent. He's given mercy. But yet, he still runs from God. And this is what is amazing to me. Cain had the greatest opportunity of anyone in the Bible. They probably, in all retrospect, probably didn't live very far from the Garden of Eden. You know that? They could probably wake up in the morning and see it from the back door. Because they didn't want to get too far away from that place. Because they remember goodness and perfectness and everything great about the Garden of Eden. So more than likely, they didn't move very far away from that place. So every day Cain woke up, he'd probably look at the Garden of Eden and see it over there. He had the greatest. To me, Cain and Judas are the two biggest failures in the Bible. I mean, you had a man by the name of Cain whose mom and dad actually could talk to God. They could speak to him. Then you had the man by the name of Judas who actually spoke with God each and every day for 3 years. And they threw it all away. There's no sorrow. There's no repentance. There's no nothing. They're not remorseful. This is what is interesting. And Cain, and this is what happens to all reprobates, people that are sinners, people who do not want anything to do with God, with his mercy and his grace. He goes out from the presence of the Lord. And he dwells in the land of Nod. That word, Nod, means exile. Do I think that Cain is going to be in heaven? No, I don't. Because the last thing we know about Cain in the book of Genesis is that he just goes out from God. Leaves his presence, leaves his mercy, leaves his goodness, leaves everything. Wants nothing to do with him. The big question is, and Cain had an opportunity, and we sing that. He had heard about God all of his life. He knew. This is what is interesting. God speaks to Cain in verse 6. Why doesn't it scare Cain to hear the voice of God? Because he's heard it a bunch. He's probably heard it 1,000 times. Because immediately God said unto Cain, does Cain say, who are you? Knows who he is, doesn't he? He spoke with him. He's talked with him. And although he knows so much about God,
He goes out from the presence of Him. Here's the big question. Why don't people just get saved? You ever thought about that? Why aren't our churches packed full? Why don't people just do right and get saved? Follow Christ and repent. I mean, if we could, and the Southern Baptists are great about doing something. They're great about programs and stuff up in Nashville, where our headquarters is at. The one thing they want to do is we got to get as many folks saved as we possibly can, which is great. But you know what? It's not going to happen. It's not. The reason people don't get saved and fall on their face before Christ is because they're like Cain. They love their sin. If they hated their sin and hated the way they was, they'd come to Christ, wouldn't they? And another reason is they don't really believe in God. If they really believed that there was a God in heaven that one day was going to come back to this earth and rapture the church out and they're going to be left, they'd get saved. They'd run to Christ. They just don't believe it. We live in Tornado Alley. If the weather starts looking kind of weird during tornado season, and a meteorologist gets on TV and says there's a tornado coming, we've been through enough tornadoes to know that he's telling the truth and we need to do something right. And we believe it. Why don't people believe when a preacher gets up behind the pulpit and say God's coming back, get right? God's coming right. He's coming back, get right. Why don't people just do it? Because God tells us and Jesus Christ tells us that they love their sin. Dear Heavenly Father, we love you and we thank you. Dear God, we love you because you first loved us. Dear God, we know that there are two roads, there are two ways, two gates, two types of